Somewhere in a museum collection, there is a small piece of bone. You could hold it in your palm. It's not painted, not sculpted, not decorated with animals or geometric designs. It's just a slender fragment, maybe the length of your finger, and along its surface runs a series of careful incisions. Deliberate, evenly spaced, grouped in a way that seems to mean something. Not random scratches from a tool or a meal. Something else. Something that looks, if you tilt your head and squint across 30,000 years, like a record. Like someone's counting. Like someone keeping track of time. That's the mystery. And it's one of the quietest, interesting mysteries in all of human prehistory. The question isn't really whether early humans were smart enough to observe time. They clearly were. The question is something more specific and more fascinating. Were they encoding time in objects? Were they making marks that represented counted intervals, nights perhaps, or months, or seasons? Were they building something we could meaningfully call a calendar? And what would that word even mean, stripped of paper and ink, and printing presses and leap years, in a world of firelight and open sky? Before we get into any of the evidence, pausing on that word, calendar. When most of us hear it, we picture something fixed. A grid, numbered squares, days assigned to weeks, weeks to months, months to a year. A system that tells you not just how much time has passed, but exactly where you are inside a cycle that repeats. That's a very particular kind of calendar. And it took thousands of years of writing, mathematics, and institutional record-keeping to build. Nobody is claiming that the people of the Upper Paleolithic had anything like that. Anyone who tells you they did is getting ahead of the evidence. But a calendar, in a broader, older sense, something that tracks a repeating cycle, that helps a person, or a group, know roughly when something is coming, when the salmon will run, or the herds will move, or the moon will return to a certain shape. That's a different kind of thing, entirely. That's a tool built from observation and memory, and a felt need to anticipate the world, and that, the evidence suggests, might be very old indeed. What we're going to explore in this episode is a slow, careful look at a handful of objects, mostly portable, mostly small, that carry marks which some researchers believe reflect deliberate timekeeping, proof, not certainty, interpretations, and the honest limits of what we can actually know when the people who made these things put no words behind. If you're listening to this right now and you're trying to wind down, this is exactly the kind of episode made for that. Long, calm, careful, with no sudden loud moments, no dramatic music swells, and no conclusions that outrun the evidence. Just an honest look at something genuinely puzzling from a very long time ago. If you find this useful for sleep or for thinking, consider following the show on Spotify. It's ad-free, music-free, and following there is genuinely one of the best ways to support the work. Link to find it in the video description. And before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Where are you right now? What time is it there? Drop it in the comments. It's one of my favourite things about making these episodes, reading through and finding someone in Melbourne at 2 in the morning. Someone in Sao Paulo at 6 in the evening. Someone in a car in Michigan in the late afternoon. All of you, in different places, in different light, listening to the same question about marks made by people who had no idea you would ever exist. There's something quietly extraordinary about that. Now, back to the bone. The objects we'll be looking at come from a period called the Upper Paleolithic, roughly 50,000 to 10,000 years ago. Though most of the interesting cases cluster in a window between about 40,000 and 10,000 years before the present. This is the era of Homo sapiens in Europe and Western Asia. People who were biologically identical to us, made figurines and flutes and elaborate burials, who painted caves with breathtaking skill, and who, apparently, sometimes sat down with a sharp stone and made very careful marks on very small objects in ways that don't look random. The big names in this debate, and it is a debate, not a settled question, include objects like the Ishango bone from Central Africa, the Lebombo bone from Southern Africa, Blanchard plaque from France, and a scattering of others from sites across Europe and the Near East. Some researchers look at these objects and see the beginnings of lunar calendars. Some see seasonal tallies. Some see hunting records, or game scores, or teaching tools. And some think the calendar interpretation is wishful, that we're reading meaning into marks that simply accumulated over time with no underlying structure at all. The honest answer is that we don't know. What we can do is look carefully at the evidence, understand what kind of argument each interpretation rests on, think clearly about what it would actually take to confirm or rule out a calendrical purpose. That's what this episode is going to try to do. Not to convince you of any single answer, but to walk through the reasoning the way good archaeology actually works. Slowly, skeptically, genuine respect for both the evidence and the uncertainty. Because here's the thing. Even if only one of these objects turns out to represent a genuine attempt to count and predict cycles of time, that would be remarkable. That would push organised timekeeping back further than most people imagine. And it would tell us something important about what the human mind was already doing, already needing, already building, very long time before anyone wrote a single word down. Let's start with what a calendar really requires, why that question is harder than it sounds. So what does a calendar actually require? That's not a trivial question, and the answer shapes everything else we're going to look at in this episode. Let's strip it down, as far as it will go. At its most basic, calendar is a system for tracking recurring cycles, for noticing that certain intervals repeat, for using that knowledge to anticipate what comes next. That's it. You don't need months with names. You don't need a week. You don't need a year divided into 12 equal parts, or a written number system, or any formal vocabulary at all. What you need is observation, way of recording what you've observed, and some regularity in the world, worth tracking. The moon rises and sets on a predictable schedule, changes shape in a cycle that takes roughly 29.5 days from one full moon to the next. Animals migrate at roughly the same time each year. Certain plants flower in certain seasons. The sun rises at a slightly different point on the horizon every morning, drifting north and south across a span of months in a pattern that repeats with extraordinary precision. These cycles don't require anyone to name them or write them down for them to be real and usable. Post. They just require someone paying close attention over a long enough period of time to recognise that the pattern exists. People living in the Upper Paleolithic were paying that kind of attention. Their survival depended on it. The question, the specific and difficult question, is whether they were also externalising that attention, putting it into objects, recording it in marks, in a way that went beyond individual memory and into something more like a shared or lasting notation. And here's where we need to be careful about vocabulary, because the words we use carry hidden assumptions. Counting is not the same as tallying. Counting is a cognitive act, an internal process of enumerating things one by one. Almost certainly every healthy human brain in the Upper Paleolithic could count in some functional sense. But tallying is something different. Tallying is the act of making a physical mark to correspond with each counted unit. 1 scratch per night, 1 notch per moon, 1 incision per kill. Tallying externalizes counting. It moves the record out of memory and into the world, where it can be revisited, read, added to, potentially interpreted by someone other than the person who made it. Notation is something different again. Notation implies not just recording a count, but encoding some kind of structure. Grouping marks in a way that reflects a pattern, separating clusters to indicate intervals, using some principle of organization that makes the marks more than a simple running total. Notation is where something begins to look like a system rather than just a record. None of these things require language in the formal sense. None of them require numerals, the abstract symbols we use for numbers. A person who has never encountered a written numeral in their life can still tally the nights since the last full moon by making a scratch on a bone each evening. The marks themselves become the number. Count is in the object, not in an abstract symbol. This distinction matters a great deal to archaeologists, because it means that the absence of formal writing doesn't rule out notation. It also means that the presence of marks doesn't prove it, and that tension, the gap between what marks could mean and what they do mean, is where most of the difficulty in this field actually lives. Archaeologists working with marked objects from the Upper Paleolithic are almost uniformly cautious. The reason isn't timidity, it's experience. Marks appear on ancient objects for all kinds. Some are clearly functional, grooves worn into stone from repeated use, cut marks from butchering animals, accidental scratches from carrying or storing an object. Some seem decorative. Some appear to indicate ownership or identity. Some might be practice strokes, a napper testing the edge of a flint, a child learning to use a burin. The challenge is that none of these alternatives leave a signature that's obviously different from intentional notation. From the outside, random accumulation of working marks and a deliberate tally can look very similar, especially after 30,000 years of handling and burial and excavation. So what would a researcher actually look for if they wanted to make a credible case that a set of marks on a bone or antler or ivory fragment represented something like a calendar? There are a few testable expectations, things you'd predict if the calendar interpretation were true, and that you'd look for in the physical evidence. First is regularity. Marks made by the same tool in the same way, with consistent spacing and consistent depth, suggest a single sustained intention, rather than accumulated incidental scratches. If every mark looks different, made with different tools at different angles, with no apparent care for consistency, the deliberate notation interpretation gets weaker. The marks look like they were made carefully, methodically, by someone who cared about keeping them uniform. It gets stronger. Second is grouping. If marks are arranged in clusters separated by gaps, that grouping needs explaining. Random accumulation tends not to produce clean clusters. But if you see, say, 7 marks, then a gap, then 7 more, then a gap, then 8, that structure suggests the maker was organizing the marks according to some underlying principle, not just adding one whenever they felt like it. The third is correspondence with natural cycles. This is the most powerful test, and also the hardest one to apply honestly. Crowd. if the total number of marks in a sequence matches the length of a lunar month, or if groups of marks sum to intervals that correspond to recognizable astronomical or seasonal cycles. That's meaningful, but you have to be careful here, because humans are extraordinarily good at finding patterns, including patterns that aren't really there. Confirmation bias is a genuine danger. A researcher who expects to find lunar cycles will often find them, whether or not they're actually present. The honest version of this test requires checking whether the correspondence holds up when you approach the object. Without a prior hypothesis, better. When independent researchers examine it and reach similar conclusions. The fourth is repeated patterns across contexts. If similar groupings and similar totals appear on objects from different sites made by times, people, in different and places, that convergence is harder to explain as coincidence. Shared structure across a range of objects suggests a shared practice, a shared framework for organising marks, which starts to look more like a cultural tradition of notation than like random scratching. Now, the honest complication is that even if all four of these tests come back positive for a given object, that still doesn't prove a calendrical intent, makes the interpretation more plausible. It raises the probability that something systematic was going on, but archaeology rarely reaches proof in the strict sense, especially for cognitive and cultural practices that left no written explanation behind, which brings up the question of dating. Because the uncertainty isn't only about what these marks mean, Hode. It's also about exactly when they were made. When you hear that an object is approximately 30,000 years old, what does that actually mean? Radiocarbon dating, the most commonly used technique for this period, works by measuring the decay of a radioactive isotope of carbon in organic materials, bone, antler, ivory, charcoal. Every living thing absorbs carbon from the atmosphere, and after it dies, the radioactive fraction decays at a known rate. By measuring how much remains, you can estimate when the organism died. The key word is estimate. Radiocarbon dates come with ranges, plus or minus a certain number of years, and those ranges get wider the older the sample is. An object dated to 30,000 years before present might reasonably from 28,000 to 32,000 years ago, and sometimes the uncertainty is larger than that. The ranges overlap. Objects that seem contemporary might be separated by centuries. Objects from different sites that appear to share a tradition might be far more or less closely related in time than the dates suggest. With the way carbon ratios in the atmosphere have varied over millennia, and with the difference between when an animal died and when someone made marks on a bone that might have been old even at the time it was used, dating the object tells you when the organic material died, not necessarily when the marks were made. Matters because when someone says that a particular piece of bone may represent a 30,000-year-old lunar calendar, there are at least two layers of uncertainty stacked on top of each other. Uncertainty about the date and uncertainty about the interpretation. Both deserve to be held clearly in mind, not as reasons to dismiss the evidence, but as reminders of how carefully we need to reason about it. This is discouraging once you get used to it. It's just the honest shape of what archaeology can and can't tell us. The marks are real. Bones are real. The question of what those marks were for is open, and it will stay open until we find better evidence or develop better methods to read what we already have. Both of those things are still possible. Researchers are still working on this, and the field moves slowly, but it moves. What we can do, right now, is look at the world these marks come from, and understand why a person living 30,000 years ago would have had very good reasons to want to track time in the first place. Imagine yourself into that world. You are living somewhere in Ice Age Eurasia or late Pleistocene Africa, in what archaeologists call the Upper Paleolithic. You don't know that term, of course. What you know is cold. Not constant, unbroken cold, but a rhythm of seasons that can be brutally sharp. Long winters where plants disappear, rivers crust over, and any mistake in planning is punished with hunger. Short summers where life explodes, plants rush through their entire growing cycle in a few frantic weeks, and animals migrate, mate, and fatten before the cold returns. Group is small. A few families, a couple of dozen people. You are not settled, you move. Maybe you have a rough annual circuit, a sequence of valleys and river crossings and rock shelters that your elders know by heart. In one place there are salmon runs, but only for a brief window. In another, reindeer or bison pass through on their migration. Somewhere else there is a patch of edible roots that can be dug after the spring thaw, a stand of trees, whose inner bark or sap can be harvested when nothing else is available. The landscape is full of resources. They are not evenly distributed in space or time. They appear and vanish according to cycles you can't control. If you're too early, the herds haven't arrived. If you guess wrong about the length of winter, and eat through your dried meat too, quickly, there might be nothing left when the snow is still on the ground and people start to weaken. Under those conditions, timekeeping is not an abstract curiosity. It's a survival skill. You don't have a calendar pinned to a wall. You do have seasons that arrive with a degree of regularity, and you have to learn to anticipate them. The question isn't, what day is it? Is the ice thinning enough to risk crossing the river? Do we have time to stay here another 10 nights before the caribou move? How many sleeps until the berries ripen on the south-facing slope? Hunting is one of the clearest examples. Large animals are not just wandering around waiting to be killed. Many of them are migratory, especially in glacial and periglacial environments. Reindeer, horses, bison, wild cattle, they follow grazing, snow lines, and insect pressure, pass through your region at certain times in vast numbers, and at other times hardly at all. If you can predict those movements, you can set up ambushes, choose the right valley, position people along a driven route. If you misjudge, you can waste precious energy moving camp only to find empty ground. Some animals are also only really huntable in narrow windows, when they're in rut and less cautious, when snowcrust will carry human weight, but not the weight of their hooves, when rivers are low enough to ford them. Knowing when those windows open and close is a kind of temporal map, layered on top of your physical map of the land. Then there are the plants. Even in harsh climates, there are edible greens, roots, nuts, seeds. They don't all appear at once. Some sprout as soon as the snow retreats. Some only form storage organs late in the season. Some are poisonous until treated or leached at particular stages. Many of them are keyed to temperature and daylight. If your group has figured out that a certain plant is best harvested about 2 lunations after the ice break, 3 lunations before the first frosts, that's already a temporal rule, a way of binding botanical knowledge to a repeating cycle. Storage adds another layer. People in the Upper Paleolithic were not just eating what they found today. There is evidence of meat drying, probable smoking, caching of food in pits or natural refrigerators. and deliberate use of caves or cold ground to keep things from spoiling, storing food. You have to think not only about how much you have, but how long it has to last. If you know from experience that the next salmon run comes about 4 moons after the reindeer migration, and that your dried meat will only carry you for 3. If you eat freely, you suddenly have a reason to track those moons more carefully. This isn't just about individuals. Upper Paleolithic groups didn't live in isolation. Evidence for long-distance movement of stone, shell, pigments and other materials points to social networks stretching over hundreds of kilometers. People met to exchange goods, information and mates. Those meetings could not have been entirely random. Travelling in Ice Age conditions is costly and dangerous. Moving a small party 50 or 100 kilometres through snow, across rivers, possibly through territories used by other groups, is not something you do on a whim. If there was a favoured valley where different bands tended to converge when the herds passed through, or a reliable shelter that served as a ritual and trading hub, then you need to be there at roughly the same time as everyone else. Arrive too early, and you may burn through your food with no one to exchange with. Arrive too late, and you've missed both the social gathering and the richest hunting. Not just, when will the animals be here? When will our relatives be here? When will those people with the good flint, or the shells from the coast, or the daughters and sons we intend to marry into? Even basic alliance maintenance has a temporal dimension. Promises to meet when the caribou return, or after 3 fat moons, are not written contracts. But they are temporal commitments. If your memory of these intervals is unreliable, you risk being the group that fails to show up, the group others stop trusting. Layered on top of resource and social rhythms are the rhythms of ritual and life history. Childbirths, initiations, first hunts, mourning periods for the dead. All of these can be tied to recurring cues. Child might be named or formally welcomed at the first full moon after birth. Coming of age test might be held when a particular constellation rises at dusk, or when the first geese are heard overhead. Memorial gatherings for the dead could be anchored to the time of year. When that person died, plants or animals associated with their story reappear. Rituals help fix memory. If your group has a story that must be told on the longest night, or a sequence of songs reserved for the first appearance of a certain star cluster before dawn, then the sky is no longer just background scenery. It's part of your calendar of meaning. This is where the heavens become more than a source of occasional wonder. In Ice Age latitudes, nights are long, especially in winter. Artificial light is firelight, flickering, local, weak. Beyond the circle of warmth the darkness is profound, and above it the sky is astonishingly clear. The Milky Way is obvious. Bright stars and planets stand out. The moon, when it's up, is a dominating presence. When it's down, the patterns of the constellations are sharp. The sky offers something the ground often doesn't. A stable, repeating show, the phases of the moon cycle, with a regular period. Certain star groups are visible only in particular seasons, rising or setting at characteristic points on the horizon. The place of sunrise and sunset shifts along the hills in a slow daily drift. Even without any mathematical theory, a patient observer can notice that when that bright cluster first appears in the evening, big herds are not far behind, or that when the sun rises farthest to the left of the big rock, the long nights are turning around. If your survival, your trade, your rituals, and your social commitments all benefit from anticipating those turning points, rather than just reacting to them, then you have reasons to pay close attention. You have reasons to remember, and you have reasons potentially to mark. Whether the marks we find on bones and antlers are that kind of memory tool is the open question. The world that produced those objects was a world where knowing when was often as important as knowing where the sky provided one of the few reliable clocks anyone could see. Host. If we want to know whether a particular object really has anything to do with timekeeping, we have to start with something much less glamorous than calendar. We have to start with when and where did this thing actually come from? Archaeology is in many ways the art of being patient with dirt. Most of the engraved bones, antlers, pieces of ivory that get pulled into calendar debates come from Ice Age layers that we date in a few overlapping ways. One is radiocarbon. Organic material absorbs radioactive carbon-14 while it's alive. When it dies, that carbon-14 decays at a known rate. Measure how much is left in a bone or a piece of charcoal and you get an age estimate. It's not a magic stopwatch. Radiocarbon gives you a range, not a precise birthday. A sample might come back as 27,400 years before present, plus or minus 300 years. On top of that, the amount of carbon-14 in the atmosphere has wobbled over time, so we have to calibrate the dates against other records like tree rings, and lake sediments can stretch or compress the apparent ages in surprising ways. For the engraved objects themselves, there's another catch. You can only radiocarbon date them if you're willing to destroy a tiny part. With very rare, famous artifacts, museums are understandably reluctant to let anyone grind off a corner. So, in many cases, we're not dating the object directly. We're dating a bone from the same layer, or a bit of charcoal from the same hearth, and assuming the engraved piece is from the same general time, brings in the second big tool. Stratigraphy, the reading of layers. Sediments build up over time. Floods lay down silt, wind piles up loess, people leave hearths and trash. In an undisturbed site, the basic rule holds. Lower is older, higher is younger. If an engraved antler comes from the same undisturbed layer as a dated hearth and tools of a particular style, we can say, with some confidence, that they belong to roughly the same period. But life and sediment are messy. Burrowing animals move things. Roots grow through layers. Ancient people dig pits, throw things in and cover them over. Later people dig into older deposits without leaving us a neat label saying, "We disturbed this." In a cave that's been used for tens of thousands of years, the floor can be a palimpsest of trampling, dumping, burning, and erosion. Pooh. This is why context becomes almost as important as the object itself. Where exactly was the engraved piece? Was it lying flat in a sealed layer beneath a rock fall? Was it in a hearth, broken and burned among food bones? Was it at the edge of a living floor, surrounded by stone tools? Or was it in a disturbed fill, mixed with material from many periods? If an object with a complex pattern of marks is found alongside hundreds of other everyday bones, no similar markings anywhere else in the deposit, one interpretation is that it's special. Another is that it's intrusive, washed in from somewhere else. Without careful field notes, photographs, and a good understanding of the site formation, possibilities are hard to separate. Associated materials help too. If the engraved bone is found with a distinctive stone tool style we know from other sites dated to say 18-20,000 years ago, tightens the case for its age. If there are shells from a coast 300 kilometers away, we know something about exchange networks. If there's ochre, or pierced teeth, or fragments of ornaments, we might suspect ritual or symbolic use, rather than butchery waste. But even once we're comfortable with when and where, we still haven't answered what for. One of the main ways archaeologists approach function is use-ware analysis, a kind of microscopic detective work on surfaces, bones and antlers that were used as tools often show characteristic wear. A polish along edges where they scraped hides, microscopic striations from working, plant fibres, rounding and chipping at points, driven into something harder. An object that's been handled a lot by human fingers can develop a soft, oily sheen in particular zones, while other areas remain rough. Breaks tell stories as well. A fresh break has a different look than one that snapped in ancient times and then weathered. Sometimes we can see that a broken piece was reworked, a jagged edge smoothed into a deliberate new form, or a fragment drilled or notched after it snapped. That suggests an object wasn't just used until it broke and then thrown away, valued enough to repair, reshape or keep. When we find engraved lines cutting across older ware, we know the markings came later in the object's life. When the ware sits on top of the lines, polishing them down, we know the reverse. The object was used after it was engraved. That ordering matters. A bone that was clearly a tool first, and only scratched at the end of its use life, might carry casual marks or idle doodles. One that was engraved early, and then carried, handled, polished for years, might have had more symbolic or mnemonic importance. And then there's the long, slow violence of time itself. Taphonomy. Taphonomy is the study of everything that happens to remains between the moment they enter the ground and the moment an archaeologist pulls them out. Chemical changes in the sediment can erode surfaces, dissolve fine lines, or create crusts that obscure them. Pressure from overlying layers can crack or warp bones. Water can carry tiny particles that scour or stain surfaces, can etch strange winding patterns that look, at a glance, a bit like engraving. Even excavation technique plays a role. Clumsy trowel, a metal probe, or even an incautious brush can leave scratches that were never there in the Pleistocene. That means we have to distinguish, line by line, what's ancient and what might be recent damage. Under magnification, intentional engravings usually have regular cross-sections, consistent depths, and sequences of overlapping strokes. Root etching or modern scratches often look shallower, more irregular, or cross older patinas in telling ways. All of this feeds into a final, comfortable truth. Interpretation is rarely a straight line from data to conclusion. It's a set of branching paths. When someone proposes that a particular piece of engraved bone is a lunar calendar, they're offering one hypothesis. Serious archaeological approach doesn't stop there. It asks, what else could these marks be? Tallying kills? Recording ownership? Practicing engraving? Part of a game? Decorative pattern with no counting involved? Some mixture of these? Post. This is where the idea of multiple working hypotheses comes in. Instead of trying to prove one favoured story right, you line up several plausible explanations and test each against the evidence. Does the spacing of the marks fit known lunar cycles better than random data would? Do similar objects in other sites show the same pattern? Is there ethnographic evidence from recent hunter-gatherers using similar objects in similar ways. Their use swear patterns that contradict a timekeeping function or taphonomic processes that might have altered the apparent pattern. The goal is not to squeeze every engraved object into a single template, whether calendar or art or magic. It's to resist single cause explanations when the evidence is thin, and to let the combination of dating, context, wear, taphonomy narrow the field of reasonable possibilities. Only after that patient, unglamorous work do we earn the right to ask the more speculative questions. When we look at a particular set of marks and wonder if someone 20 or 30,000 years ago was watching the sky and trying to anchor its rhythms to something they could hold in their hand, we're standing on this quieter foundation of careful dating and cautious interpretation. Once we've done the slow work of figuring out when and where these objects come from, the next question is more intimate. Why this thing, in this material, carried in someone's hand or pouch, or clothing? Upper Paleolithic people were surrounded by potential writing surfaces, if we use that word loosely. They had wood, bark, leaves, snow, bare earth, skin, even their own bodies. But the things that survive into our museums and collections are mostly the hard, stubborn stuff. Bone, antler, ivory, and stone weren't random choices. Large mammal bones were everywhere in Ice Age Europe. If your life revolves around hunting reindeer, horse, bison, mammoth, you're constantly handling bones. They're what's left after the meat is gone. Long bones can be split, shaped, turned into points, needles, wedges, flutes. Ribs can become plaques. Jawbones make handy handles and scrapers. Bone is relatively soft compared to stone. Good flint edge can carve it, scrape it, polish it. That makes it a natural canvas for lines, dots, and notches. Antler has different properties: tougher, springier, more elastic. Perfect for spear points, harpoons and barbed projectiles that have to withstand impact. Also satisfying to carve. Once it's seasoned, a skilled craftsperson can engrave extremely fine, controlled lines. Antler handles, batons, points with incised decorations are some of the most striking Ice Age artifacts we have. Ivory from mammoth tusks is rarer and more precious. It takes more effort to acquire and work. Shaping a tusk into a small plaque or figurine is a major investment of time and skill. When we see dense clusters of fine engravings on ivory, that's not casual doodling on a scrap. Someone has chosen one of the most valued materials available and committed to a design that would last. Stone is another option, but it comes with trade-offs. Hard stone is difficult to engrave deeply with the kinds of tools people had then. You can peck, grind, or scratch. Getting long sequences of neat, even lines is more work than doing the same on bone or antler. So we do see marked pebbles and plaques, but if you wanted a portable surface where you could build up a lot of marks over time, bone and antler were simply more efficient. Engraving itself is a skill with constraints. If you take a sharp flint or chert blade and drag it across bone, you get a line with a particular cross-section, a certain minimum width and depth. Push harder and it bites deeper. It also tends to skid or jump if the angle isn't right. To make a series of parallel notches evenly spaced, you have to control pressure, direction, and spacing with your hands and eyes. That's not trivial in poor light, with cold fingers on a curved surface. When archaeologists study these lines under magnification, they see sequences of strokes. A notch might be made by several passes, all in the same direction, building up depth. A longer groove might show a start and stop pattern. where the tool was lifted and repositioned. Cross-cut lines show which came first, like layers of paint. This lets us tell whether a cluster of marks was laid down in one sitting with a rhythm or added over time. Intentionality shows up in the regularity. Lines that keep roughly the same length, angle, spacing suggest counting or at least patterned design. Random scratches, practice cuts, or the byproduct of scraping meat tend to wander, overlap and vary. They don't usually fall into clear groups of 5 or 10 or 13. Portability is another clue. A cave wall is fixed. Whatever you draw or carve there stays in that place. To see it again, you have to come back. A small piece of bone or antler can travel with you. It can cross rivers, mountain passes, and seasonal camp moves. It can leave one valley in the spring and be in another by autumn. If you're trying to carry information that unfolds over time, days of a journey, kills on a hunt, phases of the moon, the order of rituals, the sequence of tasks in a complex project, it helps to have something that stays with you while the world changes around you. In that sense, host. These objects are more than tools or ornaments. They're potential carriers of narrative. We can imagine a hunter adding one notch for each reindeer taken that season. A healer adding a mark each time a ceremony is performed. Traveller marking camps along a familiar route. Or, as some researchers suggest, someone watching the sky and adding a mark each evening as the moon reappears or disappears behind clouds. But before we jump to record, we have to separate a few categories. Some marks are clearly ornamental. Repeated zigzags, chevrons, cross-hatching, used purely as decoration on spear points, needles, or pendants. These can be regular and precise, but they're usually arranged to frame the object, follow its edges, or create a symmetrical pattern. Their logic is visual more than numerical. Other marks look like ownership or identity signs. A distinctive set of cuts on the base of a spear, always in the same spot, signal who made it or who it belongs to. Think of it as monograms, clan badges, or maker's marks. These tend to be short, distinctive motifs rather than long series. Then, there are what we might call memory aids. Marks that help you remember a story, a rule, a sequence. Not a full-blown calendar, but a cue. A series of grouped notches that correspond to verses of a song. A set of marks that stand for the order of stages in an initiation rite. In modern terms, more like a bullet point list than a spreadsheet. Systematic records are different again. Those are cases where the marks seem to accumulate over time in a structured way, groups added next to earlier groups. Series that seem to pause and restart. Patterns that might align with cycles we can measure. Lunar months, animal migrations, flood seasons. These are the ones that catch the attention of calendar theorists. Ties all of these possibilities together is the idea of external memory. Humans have always had powerful internal memories, supported by repetition, storytelling, and shared ritual. But the moment someone scratches a line into bone, as a reminder of something that will happen, or something they don't want to forget, they've offloaded a tiny piece of cognition into the world. The bone becomes a partner in remembering. This doesn't require writing in this strict sense. There's no alphabet, no standardized numerals, no grammar. There are just durable cues that outlast a single conversation, a single hunt, a single night. They can be shown, pointed at, argued over. They can anchor a group's shared recollections. These marks are the winters we spent at the big river. These are the days of fasting before the ceremony. These are the moons since we saw that star appear. When we talk about Ice Age notebooks, this is what we mean. Not pages and ink, but portable pieces of the world turned into long-lived prompts for memory. Some may have been primarily decorative. Some may have marked ownership. Some may have tracked quantities without any link to the sky. And a very few, perhaps, may have been attempts to pin the elusive rhythms of moon and season into something you could touch. To tell those apart, we have to look very closely at the marks themselves and at the patterns they form. That brings us to counting and to the strange little problem of how to keep track of more than a handful of things. When all you have is a sharp edge and a piece of bone, if you hand almost any human a stick and a soft surface and ask them to keep track of how many, some version of the same thing appears. Tally marks, single strokes, short, repeated cuts, maybe little clusters with gaps between them. You see the same basic idea from Ice Age bone to medieval account books, to a prisoner scratching days on a cell wall. It's a simple solution to a deep problem. Our working memory is limited. We can't reliably hold long sequences of identical events in our heads without some kind of external help. But the moment a tally exists, ambiguity walks in. A notch is just a notch. Its meaning comes from the mind that made it. A run of 10 cuts could be 10 animals killed, 10 days of travel, 10 baskets of berries, 10 successful healings, 10 times the river flooded, 10 nights someone saw a particular star, 10 debts owed to another family. The marks don't tell us whether they stand for things in the world, or for events, or for obligations, for something more abstract like stages in a ritual. On Ice Age artifacts, we're usually looking at small numbers by modern standards, sequences in the tens, sometimes up into the 30s or 40s. That's already more than most people can track just by finger counting without some structure. So, tallying is a reasonable hypothesis. But tallying, what is the question that keeps archaeologists awake? One hint lies in how the marks are arranged. Humans are natural groupers. Our brains like to chunk information into manageable pieces. You can feel this when you count silently. It's hard to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 as a uniform stream. Most of us, without thinking, break it into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, or into 2s or 3s. We create mini units. The same thing happens when we make notches. If you try tallying 27 anything on a bone, you will almost certainly not produce 27 evenly spaced identical marks in a single unbroken line. Your hand will pause. The tool point will catch. Your eye will lose the exact spacing. Instead, what often shows up are clusters. 4 or 5 close together, then a slightly bigger gap, then another cluster. Or alternating short and long cuts. Or rows that shift angle partway through. Some of this is just ergonomics. Bones are curved. Tools slip. But some of it reflects how the maker was organising quantity in their mind. For researchers who want to see calendars in these objects, clusters are tantalising. If you think a piece might record days in a lunar month, then a group of 5, plus a group of 9, plus a group of 4 can start to look like weeks or phases or some encoding scheme if you're hunting for seasons. Sets of similar-sized clusters might suggest months or periods of activity. This is where things get dangerous. Humans are also pattern hunters. We are so good at seeing structure that we see it even when it isn't there. Random noise often arranges itself into runs and gaps. Flip a coin 100 times, and you will probably get streaks of heads or tails longer than you would intuitively expect. We are primed to interpret those streaks as meaningful. on a scratched bone with, say, 32 notches, purely random process of making marks along its length, would still produce accidental clusters. Some lines would end up a little closer together, some farther apart, just from hand motion and surface irregularity. If you go into that analysis already believing these must be lunar days, or these must be hunting seasons, it's very easy to draw boxes around the tight bits, call them months, and ignore the messy bits that don't fit. This is the statistical temptation, fitting the data to a pattern you already favour, instead of asking how surprising that pattern really is compared to chance or to other explanations. On a small sample of marks, any simple rule can be made to sound plausible if you tell the story well enough. So, what would make a tally sequence genuinely persuasive as more than random? Archaeologists who work on this have become increasingly strict over the last few decades. One criterion is repetition. If you have a single object whose notches can be grouped into, say, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 7, you might be able to map that onto something in nature, but that's weak evidence on its own. If you start finding many objects from different sites or layers, all using the same group sizes arranged in similar orders, the case becomes stronger. Repeated, consistent group sizes across independent artifacts suggest a shared counting convention, not just individual doodling. Second criterion is clear rules about where a sequence starts and ends. On some bones, the notches run in a neat line that clearly begins at one end of the surface and terminates at the other. On others, they wander, overlap, wrap around, or seem to be added in spare spaces with no obvious first mark. If there's a strong start-stop convention, always beginning beside a hole, always ending at an edge, always arranged in rows that don't cross, that hints at a deliberate recording system. A third is context. Bone with 29 grouped marks comes from a layer associated with seasonal reindeer migration. That's suggestive. If it comes from a burial with other objects that seem to relate to status or ritual, that suggests a different kind of meaning. Ideally, we'd see correlations between the pattern on the object and independent evidence, seasonal animal remains, hearth layers indicating specific occupation times, or even astronomical alignments at the site itself. The more those lines of evidence converge, the more comfortable we can be making specific claims. Even then, caution is warranted. One way to test an interpretation is to ask what else would be true if it's right. If a set of tallies really encodes lunar months over a year, for example, you'd expect about 12 or 13 clusters, totaling roughly 354 days. Maybe, with some adjustment marks. If someone argues that a piece tracks kills in a hunt, you might expect those numbers to fall in a realistic range for that animal and that season. Checking those logical consequences can keep us honest. Ethnographic parallels can be helpful here, but only if we handle them gently, Pratt did. In many historically documented societies, people use tallies to keep track of all sorts of things. Days of an initiation period, debts in a credit system, obligations owed to a ritual specialist, animals taken by each hunter, gifts given and received. Sometimes the tallies are on sticks, sometimes on bones, sometimes knotted cords, sometimes notches on house posts. Grouping is almost universal. 5s are common, but so are 2s, 3s, and culturally meaningful numbers. 7s, 9s, 12s. There are cases where tallies clearly relate to the sky. Some communities mark days of ritual cycles, keyed to lunar phases, or to particular stars. Key bundled sticks, where each stick stands for a month in a ritual year. These show us the range of what's possible with simple notch-based systems, and they remind us that you can build quite sophisticated calendars without writing as we know it. We can't just take a pattern from a modern herding society or a 19th century farmer and paste it onto an object from 25,000 years ago. Cultures differ, meanings shift. The fact that tallies can be lunar in one place doesn't mean they are lunar everywhere. Ethnographic analogy works best as a catalogue of possibilities, not as proof of any particular one. When we look at Upper Paleolithic tallies through this lens, they resolve into something both more modest and more intriguing. At the very least, they show people externalizing quantity, pushing numbers out of fragile memory and into durable material. Beyond that, they might encode debts, kills, days, rituals, or sky events. The clustering tells us about human cognition. The patterns, if real, might tell us about timekeeping. To decide how far we can go, we need to ask not just whether a sequence of marks could be a calendar, but what else it could be, whether the evidence really forces us one way or another. With that in mind, we can turn to the idea that has attracted the most attention of all. Some of these grouped tallies are a record of the moon itself. The moon is the obvious suspect if you're living without clocks, without printed calendars, without electric light. The moon is probably the most conspicuous, reliable, slow-changing thing in the sky you can use to structure time. It waxes, it wanes, it disappears, it returns, moves through a cycle that's long enough to feel substantial, but short enough that you can personally experience several complete runs in a season. Astronomers call that cycle the synodic month, the time from one new moon to the next. On average, it's about 29.5 days. Not 29, not 30, but right in between. What you see with naked eyes and some patience are phases. Thin crescent low in the west after sunset. Then, over a few evenings, a growing fatter crescent, then a half moon, then a bulging oval, then full. After that, shrinking again, sliding toward the morning sky, down to another thin crescent before dawn, and finally, nothing. For a couple nights around new moon, the moon is effectively gone. Humans good at binning this flow into a few salient states. Bright, full moon nights, when you can walk and hunt without a fire. The week or so of waxing, when the evening sky gets steadily brighter. The week or so of waning, when the morning sky carries the light. And the dark gap, when night is truly night. If you're trying to keep track of these by making marks, the obvious thing to count is days. You could decide, consciously or not, to scratch a notch every evening when you spot the moon and simply stop when it disappears. Then begin again when it returns. Do that for a while, and you'll notice a pattern. Sometimes you get 29 notches, sometimes 30. Over many months, the average hovers around 29.5. From a modern perspective, that's the core of the lunar hypothesis for Ice Age tallies. If an object carries a single sequence of around 29 or 30 marks, it might reflect one lunar month. If it carries several such sequences in a row, maybe separated by small gaps or orientation changes, it might be tracking multiple months. Researchers go hunting for month-length patterns. They look for sequences of marks whose total counts cluster near 2930. They look for repeated groups. Say, 4 or 5 clusters on one object, each containing numbers in the high 20s or low 30s. They look for internal structure that might map onto phases, a subgroup of 7 or 8, then a gap, then another of 7 or 8, then another, then a short group of 2 or 3 that might correspond to the dark days around new moon. On some engraved bones, antlers and tusks, you can, with a bit of squinting, see exactly that kind of structure. A famous example often brought up in this context is a reindeer bone from Western Europe that carries a long row of notches divided into several clusters. One interpretation reads these as successive lunar months. Each cluster a month, total number of clusters matching the number of months in a year. The slight variations in group size reflecting the alternation of 29 30-day months needed to stay in step with the real sky. Another widely discussed case is an engraved piece of mammoth ivory, where a run of marks has been argued to correspond to daily observations of the moon's changing shape. Pockets suggest that variations in the depth or angle of the cuts might track whether the moon was waxing or waning, a particular symbol or gap marking the new moon reset. There are also artifacts with spirals and meanders made up of small incisions, where some researchers claim to see a complete cycle of lunar days laid out in sequence. Like a prehistoric version of a desk calendar, each turn of the spiral a passage through the month. These proposals are enticing because they promise something concrete. Not just numbers, but numbers tied to an astronomical rhythm we can model precisely today. A sequence of notches really follows a 29-30-29-30 pattern over several loops, in a way that lines up with known lunation statistics, that starts to look less like random tallying and more like deliberate tracking. Mainstream archaeologists, though, have become very cautious about making that leap. One problem is sample size. Most of these artifacts are one-offs, or at best part of a very small set. You might have a single bone from a single layer at a single site, with a run of about 30 marks. That's interesting, but it's not enough to establish a tradition of lunar counting, without multiple independent examples that share the same structure. It's hard to say whether we're seeing a system, or just one person's idiosyncratic list. Another problem is the starting point. If you want to map a sequence of marks onto lunar days, you need to know where day 1 is. But on many objects, there's no clear sign of where the sequence begins. The marks may wrap around the surface, or overlap, or be interrupted by damage. You can choose to start counting at the neat end, or at the thickest mark, or at a gap that looks symbolic, but that choice is influenced by the pattern you hope to find. Even when there is an obvious beginning and end, it's often unclear whether every mark in the sequence is part of the same counting event. Some might be older, some reused surfaces, some casual scratches added later. Distinguishing between deliberate tallies and background wear is notoriously tricky. Then there's the basic ambiguity of meaning. A cluster of 29 cuts doesn't tell you what it's 29 of. The same span of days that makes a lunar month also makes a period between herd movements, a ritual seclusion, a food fermentation, a healing process, or the gestation interval of some hunted animals. Numbers that fit the moon can simultaneously fit many other aspects of life. Because of these issues, the bar for claiming this is a lunar calendar has risen over time. Many of the early, confident identifications from the mid-20th century are now treated more as interesting suggestions than as established facts. So what kind of evidence would actually strengthen the lunar hypothesis? First, repetition across artifacts. If at multiple Upper Paleolithic sites, spanning different regions, we found engraved pieces that all show similar sets of month-length clusters, say, sequences of 12 or 13 groups, each containing 28-30 marks, with a recurring pattern in how 29 and 30 alternate, that would support the idea of a shared, learned way of encoding lunar months. Second, secure dating and context. If those objects could be tightly dated, and their archaeological surroundings indicated seasonal occupation that matched the implied timing, we'd have an independent cross-check, for example. A series of tallies that looked like they ended in midwinter from a layer where animal remains, and plant residues also pointed to winter use, be more convincing than an isolated bone with no clear seasonal indicators. Third, clearer phase partitioning. If within each putative month we saw consistent substructures, perhaps one group of about 7 marks always carved in one direction, another group of 7 always carved differently, with a short gap of 2 or 3 scratched marks at the junction. Then it would be more plausible to map those onto quarters of the lunar cycle, plus the dark days. Regular internal patterning is harder to explain as random doodling. Finally, convergence with other lines of evidence for sky watching. If a site with these engraved month bones also had, say, an entrance aligned to a particular lunar standstill, or repeated motifs of crescents in its portable art, that would make an astronomical reading more attractive. It still wouldn't force the conclusion, but it would show that the people there cared about the moon in other independent ways. Right now, we're in a middle space. The moon is a very reasonable candidate for what some of these tallies could be tracking. The match between 29-30 mark sequences and the synodic month is not trivial. But the artifacts we have are few, their meanings are layered, and alternative explanations are always available, which raises another possibility that has been getting more attention. Maybe some of these counts aren't tied to the moon at all, but to the turning of the seasons on the ground. When we think calendar, tend to look up. But for hunter, gatherers in an Ice Age landscape, some of the most important clocks were on the ground. Even without numbers, you live inside a dense web of seasonal cues. The air itself shifts. Early autumn mornings bite at your fingers in a way late summer never did. The wind changes direction. The quality of light flattens. Shadows grow longer at times of day when they used to be short. Snow creeps lower down the hillsides week by week. River ice forms first in the eddies, then along the banks, then reaches across the current. Plants pulse through a cycle you learn almost by osmosis. Budding, leafing, flowering, seeding, drying, disappearing. The same patch of ground looks radically different every few weeks. Animals too move to their own seasonal rhythms. Those rhythms decide whether you eat. In parts of Ice Age Europe, large herds of reindeer, horses, bison, and wild cattle moved along fairly predictable routes. Not perfectly regular, not like clockwork, patterned enough that experienced hunters could say, at this time of year they tend to be here. Rivers, concentrated fish in certain months, when spawning runs, pushed them upstream in great silver walls of muscle. Seabirds arrived on cliffs to nest in dense colonies for a brief cacophonous window. Migratory birds passed overhead in noisy waves, northbound in spring, southbound in autumn. If you're trying to live from one year to the next, these aren't curiosities. They're deadlines. Miss the reindeer crossing the river valley. And you might miss your best chance to dry meat for the winter. Arrive at the salmon, run too early and you waste time and energy. Too late, and the run is over. The river is suddenly empty. Go to the sealing holes, too far into the season. and the ice is no longer safe to cross. One way to read some engraved bones and antlers is to see them not as lunar notebooks, but as migration calendars. You don't have to measure exact days to do this. You need to know the order of things, and roughly how long one phase lasts before the next begins. When the first geese appear, you have a mental countdown to when the rivers are clear enough to travel. When the birch catkins open, you know the reindeer won't be in the lowlands much longer. When the first frosts return, you know certain fish will soon be crowding into the shallows. Marks can encode that kind of timing. Instead of a long, continuous run of 29 or 30 cuts, trying to capture every day in a lunar month, seasonal record might be built from shorter series linked to specific events. 10 notches between reindeer at the crossing and reindeer in the high valley. 5 marks between first ice on the river and not safe to travel. 4 between salmon at the rapids and salmon gone. In biology, the study of these firsts and lasts of the year is called phenology. The first leaf, first flower, first insect, first snow, first frost. Farmers and foragers everywhere have watched these transitions because they chain together into rough but powerful prediction systems. When this happens, that will happen soon. It's entirely plausible that some Ice Age marks are phenological records. Imagine an antler, with several short groups of notches, each associated. Perhaps in the maker's mind, perhaps in a shared tradition, with a particular cue, cluster, that stands for the days from the first bugling of the reindeer rut to its peak, nuzzer, for the interval between the arrival of migratory birds and the growth of certain edible seeds, another for the lag between the first permanent snow and the time when river crossings become too dangerous. None of this requires the moon. It only requires careful observation, memory, and a desire to externalize part of that memory in a portable, durable form. There's another strong seasonal anchor that often gets overlooked in these discussions. The bodies of the animals themselves. Big Ice Age herbivores didn't reproduce year-round. Many had distinct mating seasons and fairly fixed gestation times. That means births tended to cluster in particular windows of the year. For people whose survival depended on those animals, it's crucial information. If you know that most reindeer calves are born in late spring, you can aim for hunts that either capitalize on heavily pregnant females when they're slower, or, more likely, avoid harvesting too many pregnant animals earlier in the year, so as not to damage the herd's long-term health. You also know that certain months will flood the landscape with vulnerable young animals, easier prey, but also a sign of the herd's future. Some researchers have suggested that pregnancy and birth seasons could serve as a natural backbone for timekeeping. Approximate number of days between rut and birth is relatively stable within a species. Even without counting each day, you might learn that 3 handspans of time or so many sleeps link those events. On a tally bone, this might appear as repeated, similar length sequences, each associated with a different species' reproductive cycle, or the same species observed in multiple years. Not a lunar grid of anonymous days, but a set of intervals tied to very specific embodied events. Rut calls heard at night, swollen bellies, first wobbling calves. This kind of system would have a distinctive archaeological fingerprint, where a lunar interpretation expects long, nearly continuous count lines. Attempts to follow day after day, a seasonal event-based system is more likely to give us many shorter series, repeated patterns of, say, 4, 6, 8 marks, separated by clear gaps or changes in orientation. The important thing is not, I marked every day, but I marked how long it was between these two crucial happenings. From this perspective, the relative scarcity of really long, unbroken sequences on many Ice Age artifacts becomes less of a problem and more of a clue. Perhaps people weren't trying to track every day of the year. They were tracking stretches that mattered. The run-up to a migration, the span of safe river travel, the window of reliable snow for certain hunting techniques. A seasonal system like this can still be incredibly sophisticated. It can be shared orally across groups, taught to children, embedded in stories about animals and spirits and landscape features. The marks don't need to stand alone as a complete calendar. They might function as prompts, reminders, or mnemonic hooks that link back into a rich web of narrative and practice. Doesn't have to be either or. A community could notice that certain phenological events drift with respect to the moon, or that the easiest way to estimate when the salmon will run is after 2 full moons from the first frost. That's where seasonal and lunar systems can begin to intertwine. Before we get to those hybrid possibilities, though, there's one more vast, slow, reliable timekeeper that would have been inescapable for Ice Age people. Not just the moon above the horizon, but the fixed stars beyond it. If you live your whole life outdoors, the night sky is not a backdrop. It's part of the environment, real and structured as the hills and rivers around you. Even without instruments, you can't help but notice patterns. Some stars rise and set like the sun, popping up over one part of the horizon, arcing across the sky, and disappearing behind another. Others, if you live far enough from the equator, never quite set. They circle around a point in the sky, night after night, like sparks whirling around an invisible centre. You notice that different stars dominate different parts of the year, bright patterns that ride high overhead on summer nights, but are completely missing in winter. Others seem to announce the cold season, glittering low over the horizon. When the nights are long and your breath steams in the air, some stars show up just before dawn at certain times of year, appearing for a brief season in the eastern twilight and then vanishing again for months. You don't need a telescope or mathematics to see this. You just need time, clear skies, and a reason to be awake in the dark. Ice Age people had all three. And they had something else. Stable horizons. The stars themselves move in complicated arcs. The edge of the land and sea does not. A particular notch in a distant ridgeline, the sharp point of a mountain peak, the angle of a cliff above a valley floor. These are fixed reference points that let you say, not just, that bright star is back, that bright star is rising from that gap again. Once you notice that certain stars appear in predictable places along the horizon at particular seasons, you have the raw material for another kind of calendar. Stars first peaks out of the cleft in the hills, when the ice on the river is almost gone. 3 stars climb over the far ridge, when the birds start nesting on the cliffs, ghostly band of the Milky Way. Tips from nearly upright to nearly horizontal as the year turns. The same way the sun's rising point creeps north and south through the seasons. In this kind of world, the landscape and the sky fuse into one giant, slowly turning instrument. You can imagine people building up shared knowledge around this. An elder might say, when the hazy river of stars lies across the valley, you have already missed the reindeer at the ford. Or, when that bright star rises from behind the lone rock and vanishes into the notch, Count 3 sleeps and the salmon will rise. For archaeologists, this is where horizons become important. Natural features. Those notches and ridgelines and isolated boulders are effectively permanent on human timescales. If we find a camp that was occupied over many generations, and we can reconstruct the ancient horizon from that spot, we can ask, were there particular sightlines to the rising or setting of the sun, moon, or bright stars at key dates? This is the basic logic of archaeoastronomy, studying how ancient people might have used the sky by looking at alignments between built or chosen places and astronomical events. In later periods, this is easier. A stone circle or a long, straight passage in a tomb gives you a very clear line of sight to test. With Ice Age camps and caves, things are murkier. We're often dealing with ephemeral structures, fire pits, and natural openings, rather than monumental architecture deliberately oriented in one direction. That means we have to be cautious. If you stand anywhere on Earth and start drawing lines on the horizon, some of them will, by chance, point towards something astronomically interesting. A solstice sunrise, an equinox sunset, the rising point of a bright star, the more stars you're willing to consider, and the more special dates you're willing to test, the easier it is to find an alignment that seems meaningful, but is actually just coincidence. This is the overfitting problem in archaeoastronomy. Proud. If you take a bone covered in marks and decide that any cluster of notches can stand for any star, and any break between clusters can stand for any date, you can explain almost anything. The result looks impressive on a diagram, but it doesn't necessarily tell us what the maker actually meant. So responsible archaeoastronomy does a few things. First, it starts with simple, high-impact phenomena. Solstices, equinoxes, helical risings of very bright stars, the general tilt of the Milky Way. These are hard to miss if you're paying attention. Second, it uses statistics and comparisons. Are the proposed alignments better than what you'd expect from random orientations? Do multiple sites in a region show similar patterns, or is each one unique? And crucially, it has to take deep time into account. The sky we see today is not exactly the sky people saw 30,000 years ago. Earth's axis slowly wobbles like a spinning top, process called precession. Over about 26,000 years, this wobble shifts which stars are near the celestial poles and slowly drags the rising and setting points of stars along the horizon for any given calendar date. On human timescales, a lifetime, even many generations, this change is glacially slow. Your great-grandchildren will see almost the same dawn star patterns you do. But over tens of thousands of years, the differences add up. So when someone claims that a 30,000-a-year-old bone encodes the rising of a particular modern constellation on a particular date, we have to ask, was that constellation even in that position back then? Did those stars form a distinctive pattern in that sky? Or has precession moved everything enough that we're retrofitting our present-day constellations onto a very different celestial backdrop for broad things, like the existence of a bright band of starlight we call the Milky Way? The simple fact that some regions of the sky are crowded with bright stars and others are sparse. Precession doesn't matter. Milky Way was there. The dense star fields toward its centre were there. The contrast between rich and empty patches of sky was there. For detailed claims about specific stars and constellations, precession matters a lot. What then? Plausible star-related record from the Ice Age look like? It probably would not look like a modern star chart. No grids, no coordinates, attempt to map the whole sky. That level of abstraction seems far beyond what's implied by the simple tally bones we've been discussing. Instead, we might expect to see recurring markers tied to a handful of especially salient events. The first annual appearance of a very bright star at dawn, period when a striking star group stands above a particular landmark at nightfall, the seasonal tilt of the Milky Way as seen from a favoured campsite. Translated into marks, that might mean short, repeated sequences associated, perhaps through oral tradition, perhaps through carved symbols, with those sky events. Not this notch stands for star X at declination Y, but this run of marks is the interval between the first rise of that bright star and the usual time we leave for the high valley. You can think of it as another layer on top of the seasonal and lunar systems we've already explored. The moon gives you a rhythm of nights. Plants and animals give you grounded local cues. The stars and the Milky Way give you anchors, slowly shifting but reliable signals that unfold at the same time every year, within the span of a human life. Some Upper Paleolithic people were indeed tracking star events. Their records would almost certainly be woven into this bigger fabric, a practical, story-laden web of when this star rises here, those animals move there, rather than an abstract astronomy textbook carved on bone. In the next turn of our investigation, we'll look at the few portable objects that have been claimed to encode exactly that kind of layered timing. Not just tallies, but symbols and figures that might link sky, season, and story into a single, carried-in-the-hand design post. When you move from horizons and camp layout to objects you can hold in your hand, the puzzle changes. A line of sight to a solstice sunrise is anchored in rock. It doesn't travel, but a carved plaque tucked into a pouch, decorated spear. Thrower, passed from parent to child, that can move with you from valley to valley, season to season. Whatever meaning it carries has to survive that movement. It has to be legible, at least to the people who share the code. Paleolithic Europe is full of such objects. Small female figurines with exaggerated features, flat plaques of bone or stone, with animals incised on one side, and seemingly abstract marks on the other. Spear throwers and harpoons, whose hooks and handles are carved into bison, ibex, mammoths, birds, sometimes entangled in ways that don't quite match everyday scenes from the hunt. On the surface, these are art. But in a world without writing, the line between art, information, and sacred object doesn't really exist. The same figurine can be beautiful, emotionally powerful, and also function as a kind of portable memory device. Archaeologists have long noticed that certain motifs repeat across wide areas and long spans time. Simple shapes, zigzags, chevrons, parallel lines, ladder-like patterns, branching Ys, groups of dots, more naturalistic things too, particular ways of drawing a bison's head, a fish, a reindeer in profile, a bird in flight. Sometimes the same abstract mark appears on the flank of an animal in a cave, on the edge of a pendant, and along the shaft of a spear thrower. These repetitions almost certainly mean something. The question is, what? The most conservative answers about identity and social links. Repeated sign might be a kind of clan emblem, the Ice Age equivalent of a family crest or a team logo. Put it on a tool, and you've marked who made it, or who owns it, paint it. In, cave, and you've claimed that place as part of your group's story. This fits well with what we know from later hunter-gatherer. Portable objects often carry marks that signal belonging to a lineage, ritual association, a region. They're social flags. But symbols don't have to stop there. Take a long bone with an animal carved at one end and a row of short marks at the other, or a plaque with an ibex on one side and a sequence of dots and lines, arranged in little clusters on the reverse. These combinations raise a different possibility, that the object is linking a being, animal, spirit, ancestor, with a sequence in time, not a calendar in the modern sense. Laid out, month by month, but a remembered rhythm. You can imagine an elder running a finger along the notches while telling a story. When the snow is still deep and the moon is thin, we do nothing. Then, after this, many nights when the moon is fat again and the river ice cracks, we begin the ibex hunt. The animal on the plaque anchors the story. The marks anchor the timing. That's the idea behind theories that some Upper Paleolithic objects work as mnemonic devices, physical prompts that cue a sequence of memories, actions, or rituals. If you already know the story, you don't need a full script. You just need the hooks. A particular animal, distinctive sequence of lines. The way those lines are grouped. These can operate like chapter headings in a book you carry in your head. Under this view, a series of symbols on a figurine or tool could encode a ritual calendar without spelling it out in any way we would recognize as writing. Each sign stands not for a single word, but for a whole bundle of associations. A season, a place, a social obligation, a set of actions, a song. Some researchers have gone further, suggesting that specific repeated signs correspond to specific seasonal phases, rutting time for certain animals, salmon runs, bird migrations, the thaw and freeze of rivers. If that's true, then strings of those signs might be compressed seasonal narratives. From the bison's rut to the salmon's run to the reindeer's return. It's an elegant idea. It would make these objects portable schedules for ritual and subsistence. Fold-up calendars you can slip into your bag. This is where the limits bite. We almost never find an Ice Age object with a translation key beside it. There's no inscription pointing to a series of marks saying, "This means spring, this means ibex, this means wait 10 nights." All we have is repetition and pattern. For symbol meaning to be recoverable, archaeologists look for strong contextual repetition. Does the same mark always appear with the same animal, in the same part of caves? Near evidence of a particular activity. Does it recur in the same position on tools used for one specific task? Do sequences repeat in the same order across multiple sites separated in space and time? Sometimes we see hints of this. Certain signs really do seem to favour particular animals or cave zones. Some sequences of abstract marks are copied with remarkable fidelity on different objects hundreds of kilometres apart. But hint is not the same as dictionary. Many motifs are flexible. The same zigzag can show up near water bones in one site and reindeer bones in another. A ladder-like pattern might appear beside cave lions in one region and mammoths in another. It's hard to know whether we're looking at a precise code or a broad visual style. We also have to resist the temptation to declare that any repeated mark is about time. Symbols can carry layers of meaning that have nothing to do with calendars. A sign might invoke a mythic being, mark a taboo, signal a marriage alliance, or indicate that a ritual has been performed. It might be a game score, a teaching tool, simply an aesthetic tradition passed down, because people liked how it looked. At the same time, art and timekeeping are not mutually exclusive. A single object can be beautiful, sacred, and practical all at once. A carved spear thrower shaped like a reindeer might express group identity, recall an origin story, and still be handled in a specific season. When a certain star appears and the actual reindeer move, the same symbol can be about who you are, where you belong, and when you do things. Upper Paleolithic people were using portable art as part of their typing toolkit. We should expect exactly this kind of layering, clean separation between calendar device and ritual object. But hybrid things where counting, memory and story are fused. To move beyond speculation, we need criteria. What would really convince us that a figurine or plaque encodes time in a structured way, not just in our imagination? That's the next step. Asking what a true Ice Age calendar would have to look like, and what kinds of evidence on bones and tools and cave walls would finally let us say, with some confidence, that we've found one. If we're going to use the word calendar for anything in the Upper Paleolithic, we need to be clear about what would actually justify it. Just, this looks kind of orderly, or I can fit these numbers to the moon if I squint. We need a ladder of evidence, and we need to know which rungs we're standing on. At the bottom are the suggestive patterns. These are the things that first make archaeologists sit up. Sequences of marks that cluster into groups, rather than being scattered at random. Numbers that hover suspiciously close to 12, 13, 29, 30. Repeated pairings between certain animals and certain sign combinations. On their own, these are invitations, not answers. Bone with 29 notches is interesting. A plaque with 4 groups of 7 marks is interesting. A line of dots that seems to change in a stepped pattern is interesting. Interesting is not the same, as this is a deliberate time-keeping device. Jump a rung, and you get to more robust patterning. Consistent rules in how marks are made, grouped, and ordered. Are tall notches always used as separators between groups of smaller ones? Do sequences always run in one direction? Are there start and stop signs? Special motifs that reliably bookend a series. This kind of internal structure matters because calendars are not just piles of counts. They're organised. There's a logic that tells you where you are within a cycle, what comes next when you loop back to the beginning. But even a neat internal scheme can still be a code for something other than time. It might be a ranking of social groups, a list of ritual steps, a set of taboos. To move higher up the evidentiary ladder, we have to ask how well the patterns line up with independent signals from the same time and place. This is where cross-checking comes in. Imagine you have a level of sediment that, from animal bones and plant remains, you can tell represents repeated spring occupations, migratory birds, newborn ungulates, pollen from early flowering plants. In that layer you find several engraved bones, all with a similar series of marks that seem to count from a low number up to a higher one, then reset. If you can show that these mark sequences could track, say, the number of nights from the first appearance of a particular star at dawn to the arrival of a known animal migration, and that this star, that migration, and these engravings all belong to the same seasonal slice. That's not just numerology anymore. You're cross-linking the marks to a seasonal reality you can test. Or take a site where the stratigraphy captures a run of years. Suppose find a sequence of objects through the layers that show the same counting scheme, adjusted in ways that fit known lunar cycles, tiny corrections that map much way real moons slip against the solar year. Now, you're not just matching bone to bone, you're matching bone to sky mechanics. The stronger the fit between mark sequences and independently reconstructed seasonal events, animal breeding, seasons, plant fruiting times, river freeze and thaw, phase of the moon at key moments. The more confident you can be that you're dealing with time, not something else. Above that, another rung. Replication across regions. One group on one river system develops a quirky way of scratching tally marks. That's interesting but parochial. If, across hundreds of kilometers and thousands of years, different communities are using closely similar structures, same grouping rules, same separators, same special motifs at transitions, that starts to look less like personal style and more like a shared conceptual technology, especially if those similar structures are tied to similar ecological constraints. For example, people in two distant valleys, both engrave sequences, that line up with the rutting cycle of reindeer, and both inhabit latitudes where that rut occurs at roughly the same time relative to the shortening days. Both use the same sign to mark the turning point in the sequence. That is the kind of convergence that suggests a common underlying calendar, logic, not identical art. Identical problem being solved in a similar way. Even replication and cross-checking won't convince us if we're not sure the marks were deliberately made to be counted. Intentionality is crucial. Bone used to scrape hides will pick up scratches. A tool held in the same grip for years will wear grooves. Decorative patterns can produce repeats that are numerically tidy just by accident. So archaeologists look closely. Are the marks evenly spaced? Do they share a uniform depth and angle that implies they were made with counted blows? Are there corrections? Crossed out notches? Carved lines? That suggest someone was keeping track and made a mistake. They also look at placement. Marks used for counting tend to be isolated along edges where a finger can run, or arranged in sequences you can follow without visual confusion. Decorations, by contrast, often fill surfaces in more diffuse ways, wrapping around objects, integrating with animal bodies, flowing with no clear start here, point. If an object's layout seems designed for sequential attention, one end clearly the beginning, marks progressing along a path that would guide a fingertip. That's a clue that the maker expected it to be read, not just admired. Now imagine all these strands coming together. You have an engraved piece of antler whose marks are intentional, carefully made and clearly ordered. The sequence aligns convincingly with a lunar or seasonal cycle, reconstructed from independent evidence at the site. The same structural pattern shows up with minor variations on other objects from neighbouring regions occupied at similar times. The use-wear analysis shows that the edge with the marks has been rubbed and handled far more than other parts of the object, implying repeated consultation. That convergence, context, structure, and use-wear, all pointing in the same direction, is as close as we're likely to get to a smoking gun. Context tells you what seasonal challenges people faced when the object was made. Structure tells you whether the marks encode a repeatable system rather than a one-off tally. Use-wear tells you the object wasn't just made and discarded, but picked up again and again in circumstances where its information mattered. At that point, the line between maybe this is a calendar and it would be perverse not to see this as some kind of calendar becomes very thin. We're not there yet for most Upper Paleolithic objects. Many sit on the lower rungs. Intriguing patterns without enough cross-checking, elegant sequences without clear ties to site seasonality, or carefully made marks on tools whose use-wear screams everyday scraping, careful counting. Which brings us to a sobering part of the puzzle. Before we promote any one piece of bone or antler to world's oldest calendar, we have to ask what else it could reasonably be, and whether those alternatives fit the evidence just as well, or better. The most obvious alternative starts with something very down to earth. Who owned what, and who owed what, to whom? In small mobile groups, personal property is limited, but it isn't non-existent. A finely worked spear point, a favourite scraper, piece of antler, with particular sentimental or ritual importance. These could matter a lot post. If you live in a world where everyone's toolkit looks roughly similar, adding marks to an object is an easy way to signal. This one is mine, or this belongs to our family, not yours. Those marks don't have to be portraits or elaborate clan symbols. They can be sequences of little cuts, grouped in ways that people in your band understand instantly. 3 short lines and 1 longer slash might mean an individual. 4 repeats of that cluster might mean a household. A row of symbol groups might encode a chain of exchange. Who gave this object to whom and when? When archaeologists today find repeated motifs on tools scattered across a site, one plausible reading is time. Another is identity, a series of similar mark groups on blades found in a single hut. Might not be a calendar at all, way of saying this bundle of tools belongs together. This is our set. The same goes for trade. Upper Paleolithic people were not isolated, moved stone, shells, pigments, and finished objects across astonishing distances. Props. If you send a prized antler, point down a chain of exchanges that stretches for hundreds of kilometres, you might want a way to keep track of its history. Mark clusters could be counters of journeys. Each group who handles the object adds its own little signature, or its own tally of how many gifts have been given in return. In that reading, a long sequence of marks is not counting nights or moons, but counting social obligations. Debts cleared, visits made, alliances renewed. Pattern might still be regular and structured, because social life has rhythms too. Ritual gatherings every year or every few years, rules about gift exchange that repeat in cycles. But those cycles are not necessarily anchored to the sky. Then there are tallies that are obviously counts, but not necessarily calendars. Hunters need to keep track of kills. Not out of vanity, because numbers matter. If you overharvest a herd near your winter camp, you may starve next year. If you begin to notice, over several seasons, that after a certain number of animals are taken, the herd fails to recover, you have learned something crucial about sustainable hunting, long before anyone uses that word. A bone covered in notches could be a hunting log. Each mark a reindeer, a bison, a horse. Groups of marks might separate different species or different hunting grounds. A longer notch might mark a particularly notable kill, the first of the season, or one that saved the group during a lean stretch. Similarly, toolmaker might track maintenance. Imagine a long, narrow sliver of bone used as a kind of service record. Every time a spear shaft is straightened, every time a point is resharpened, you add a notch. Clusters could correspond to replacement thresholds, to 4 sharpenings. You know a blade is getting too short and brittle. After a certain number of repairs, spear shaft is more likely to snap at a critical moment. Counting interventions is a way to plan for failure before failure kills you. These practical logs could be neatly ordered, carefully spaced, even grouped into sets that happen to hover around moon-like numbers, especially if hunts and maintenance routines are seasonally patterned. But their organising principle is not, what day is it, this. It is, how many of this have we done, and when do we need to act again? And then complicating things further, there is learning. Not every mark on an ancient object was made in deadly seriousness. Some were made by people practicing, playing, or teaching. Stone carving and engraving are skilled activities. You don't hand a rare, beautiful piece of ivory to an untrained teenager and say, "Good luck, don't mess it up." You start them on offcuts, broken bones, scrappy places where it doesn't matter if the lines wander, where repeating the same gesture over and over is the entire point. Archaeologists sometimes find objects whose marks are inconsistent, different depths, different angles, irregular spacing, interrupted sequences that stop halfway and begin again. These could be students' exercises. Young hands learning how hard to press, how to keep a rhythm, how to follow an invisible line. Games blur into this too. If you have children, you already know how quickly a smooth stick or a flat bone becomes a game board. You scratch rows of lines and play with pebbles, inventing rules, making up races, counting forward and back. In a community where formal teaching is mostly done through imitation and story, play is one of the safest places to experiment with numbers, order, and symbols. A piece of antler with 3 parallel rows of marks might, in this light, be the Upper Paleolithic equivalent of a board game. The counts matter inside the game, not as a record of external days or moons. The rhythms are invented, not observed. Ritual adds another layer of possible counts that have nothing to do with astronomy. Human cultures, everywhere, develop taboo periods and formal sequences. Days of seclusion after a birth, nights of vigil after a death, steps in an initiation ceremony, intervals between ritual cleansings or offerings. These are often counted in songs, in beads, in knots, or in scratches on whatever is at hand. Because repeating the correct number is part of what makes the ritual effective, or at least respectable. In a small group where everyone knows that after a death you must fast for 4 nights, so someone might mark those nights on a bone, one by one, as a way of leaning on something solid while emotions are raw. Initiation rites might last a symbolic number of days, perhaps mirroring animal behaviours, perhaps embedded in myth, without being synced to lunar phases. The key is completion, reaching the number that tradition demands. Those sequences can look every bit as deliberate and structured as a lunar tally. They might be grouped in sacred numbers, repeated across generations, even shared across regions where related groups share the same ritual calendar. But their logic is mythic and social, not astronomical. Finally, there's the part that resists any simple explanation. Objects that lived long, complicated lives, tempted to treat a marked bone as if all its incisions were made at once, by one person, with one purpose. Partly a bias of how we encounter them now. Laid out in museums with neat labels, frozen in a single moment of interpretation. Reality could be far messier. An antler fragment might begin its life as a functional tool, picking up a few incidental scratches. Later, its owner might straighten one edge and add a tidy row of notches as a hunting tally. Years after that, someone else might carve a small motif into the opposite side as a personal sign, or add a short run of marks to count nights of mourning. A third person might inherit the same object, and, valuing its age, use it in teaching, scratching practice lines near the older, deeper cuts. When we hold it tens of thousands of years later, all of those episodes are collapsed into one surface. Some parts of the mark pattern might genuinely correspond to a sequence of days or moons. Other segments might be personal signatures, repairs, or later additions that had nothing to do with counting time. A single artifact can move over its lifetime, from tool to token to teaching aid to heirloom. So when we ask, is this a calendar? We might be asking the wrong kind of yes or no question. The safer and more honest question is, which marks on this object, in which phase of its life, if any, were being used to track a repeating cycle in the world outside the maker's mind? Moon, season, ritual, or something else? Only when the timekeeping explanation clearly does more work and fits more of the evidence than these alternatives. Ownership, trade, hunting, maintenance, learning, ritual. Do we start to lean toward calendar rather than interesting tally? And even then, we have to remember, in a world where memory, story and symbol are woven tightly together, an Ice Age calendar may never have been just a calendar. Imagine, for a moment, that you live in a world where nothing is written down, but not, almost, nothing is forgotten. Names of rivers, paths between valleys, the way the wind smells before a storm, the exact bend in the horizon where the sun first appears. On the day you should start moving camp, these live people, not in objects. They're carried in voices, in gestures, in repeated stories. In that kind of world, a marked bone does not have to hold the whole message. It only has to whisper the beginning. You don't need a full calendar carved into ivory if everyone already carries a shared mental calendar, stacked with stories. What you might want instead is a prompt. A small, durable prod to memory that says, now is the time to remember that story. Or ask the elder about what happens next. Think about how we use reminders today. If you already know your friend's number, single initial on a phone screen is enough for you to recall the whole person. A short phrase on a sticky note can stand in for a complex task because the real data lives in your head. Upper Paleolithic marks could have worked the same way. Cluster of 4 short notches, and one long one might not be a sentence in itself. It might simply be the agreed sign for a particular episode in a myth. Say, the moment when a certain animal appears, or a legendary journey begins. Proud. Every time the group passes a place in the landscape that lines up with that cluster in the sky, or that phase of the moon, someone points to the marks and the story unfolds. From the outside, we see 5 lines. Inside the culture, people hear a narrative. To make that work, you need specialists. Not in the modern sense of a professional priesthood, maybe, but in the sense of people whose role is to remember and recite. Most hunter-gatherer societies we know today have them. Storytellers, ritual leaders, skilled trackers whose knowledge of animal movement borders on the uncanny. Elders who know the sky. They're not necessarily more intelligent than anyone else, but they are entrusted with certain patterns. When the salmon used to run, when the first frost usually comes, when the Pleiades rise just before dawn. In an Ice Age band of 30 people, nobody is hoarding information for power in a bureaucratic sense. But there may still be someone you turn to in late autumn and ask, is this the right moon to move? Or someone who, during a ceremony, is responsible for keeping the count. How many days of seclusion, how many nights of song? Now add simple marks to that social structure. A short line of notches on a portable object could act as a shared schedule, one that only makes sense in conversation with the keeper of knowledge. The marks tell you, we're in the 3rd phase. The elder tells you what the 3rd phase means. Which stories are told, which animals are taboo, which paths are opened or avoided. In this way, counting, memory and story fold into each other. The units of the calendar are not abstract dates, but named times. The moon of thin ice, the return of the geese, the nights of watching, the first storm from the north. The sky gives you periodic cues. The swelling and shrinking moon, the slow drift of certain stars along the horizon, the shortest day when the sun seems to hesitate before turning back. The land adds its own signals, first midges hatching over a river, the shedding of reindeer antlers, the mud at a particular pass finally thawing. Ceremonies then lock these cues into human life. You can imagine rituals that only happen when several signals coincide. When this moon looks like this, and that star rises at dusk, and you've seen the first tracks of a certain animal, then the group gathers to perform a known sequence. Songs. Offerings may be a controlled burn of the landscape, maybe the departure to a familiar hunting ground. Each ritual is anchored in time by the world itself. The marks, scratched into bone or antler, do not replace those cues, they scaffold them. A short tally might track nights of chanting until the final, most important part of the rite. A series of groups might correspond to stages in a long initiation that spans seasons, each cluster standing for a teaching story that must be told before the next one begins. In that light, calendar is not one big thing living in one big place. It is distributed. Some of it is in the sky that everyone can see. Some of it is in pathways and campsites, known only to people who have travelled them. Some of it is in the bodies of elders who remember when the game failed one year because the group moved too late. And some of it is in small, silent objects, bones, antlers, bits of ivory or stone, each carrying a thread of the overall pattern. Different artifacts might emphasize different threads. One person might carry a winter piece, whose notches only matter between first snowfall and the return of the sun. Another object might be a summer tracker, its marks only relevant when the days are long and certain berries ripen. A third might be tied to a particular constellation or horizon marker, time that star aligns with that notch in the landscape. A new set of marks becomes relevant. Together, across people and things, you get something calendar-like. An organised way of noticing and naming recurring times, predicting enough about the near future to act with some confidence. But it's not the same as our printed grids with numbers in boxes, closer to a woven fabric of cues, stories and small counts. Miss a piece and the rest can still function. Lose too many pieces and the group has to improvise or risk hunger. Underneath all of this is a very old human impulse, to make the future feel less like a storm and more like a path. If you know or believe you know that after this moon there will be that ritual, after that star rises at dusk, the herds should begin to move. After this many nights of mourning you may speak the dead person's name again. Then the chaos of weather and chance becomes slightly more bearable. Marks help, because they hold a fragment of that order outside your own mind. Faust. Help, because they wrap those fragments in meaning and emotion, making them easier to remember and to teach. Counting helps, because it lets you step out of the blur of one day following another, and say, not yet, or soon, or now, whatever else they were doing with those bones and antlers. The people who made them were almost certainly doing that, using every tool they had, memory, narrative, careful tallies, to tug a little bit of predictability out of a dangerous world. Whether we decide to call the result a calendar is, in the end, our problem. For them, it may simply have been the way time became something you could live inside, instead of something that just happened to you. So where does all of this leave us? We have bones and antlers and bits of ivory covered in marks. Some are grouped in ways that seem to echo lunar cycles. Others appear to cluster around plausible seasonal counts. Few rare pieces seem to combine several sequences, as if tracking more than one kind of recurrence at once. But none of them come with instructions. When archaeologists talk about a calendar for the Upper Paleolithic, they're really moving along a spectrum of possibilities. One end is the very cautious view. These are tallies. They may record kills or days of a hunt or stages of an initiation rite. They may be nothing more than careful counting, with no fixed tie to moon or season. In the middle are interpretations that see structured time, but stop short of a full calendar. On this view, the marks help track recurring phases, certain portions of a lunar cycle, the rough interval between known events, maybe the duration of a ritual period. They're anchored to the world, but loosely, in a way that needs constant interpretation by living people. At the far end are the more ambitious proposals that some of these objects encode an entire year-like sequence, months or seasons in deliberate order, perhaps even linked to particular phases of the moon or positions of stars along the horizon. Host. In other words, something recognisably calendar-like, even if it doesn't match our later written systems. Right now, the safest place to stand is probably somewhere between the first two. There's strong evidence for counting. There's decent circumstantial evidence that some counts were aligned with repeating natural rhythms. The lunation of migratory seasons, predictable phases of the cold and the thaw. But the claim that we already have a complete, portable Ice Age calendar, something that could unambiguously tell you, this is the 10th moon of the cycle, the salmon should be running, is still unproven. That doesn't mean the idea is wrong, just means the bar for calling something a calendar has to be high, and we aren't quite over it yet. The good news is that our tools for getting closer are improving. First, dating. Many of the objects with intriguing markings were excavated decades ago. Their ages were estimated from the sediment around them or from association with other finds. Today, we have more precise radiocarbon methods, better calibration curves, and a better understanding of site formation. As laboratories redate old collections, we can place each marked object more firmly in time and see whether similar patterns really cluster in particular periods or are spread widely across tens of thousands of years. Second, microscopy. High-resolution 3D microscopes can distinguish between different kinds of cuts. The deep, repetitive strokes of deliberate notching, the shallower striations of butchering, the scratches caused by post-burial movement. They can sometimes tell whether a sequence of marks was made in one sitting or added in stages. That, in turn, helps us see whether a set of notches represents a single count, a running total, or a composite record layered over months or years. Third, residue and wear analysis. Some marked pieces show polish, staining, or microscopic traces of fat, pigment, or plant material. Bone with apparent time marks was regularly handled, suspended, or rubbed. It might have been a tool, an ornament, or a ritual object. Residues suggest it was used in food processing or hunting. The marks might be tied to those activities. In rare cases, there might even be traces of pigment in the grooves themselves, hinting that the notches were highlighted to be seen clearly in firelight, or retouched during specific ceremonies. The more we know about how an object lived in people's hands, the better we can guess how its marks functioned in their minds. There's something just as important, better data about the marks themselves. Right now, many pattern claims rely on relatively small samples, or on hand-drawn reproductions of engravings made years ago. Tiny errors in copying, or unconscious bias, in deciding where one group of marks ends and another begins, can easily create patterns that vanish when you look more closely. Digital imaging and open databases can change that. Imagine hundreds of engraved bones and antlers scanned in high resolution, their marks measured and catalogued in consistent ways. Length, depth, angle, spacing, sequence. Imagine this data being openly available so that different teams can test the same hypotheses. Do clusters really recur in numbers that match lunar months? Breaks between groups fall in regular intervals? Are special marks, longer strokes, deeper cuts, different orientations, placed at consistent positions, or are we seeing order in what is mostly variation? With a large shared dataset, it becomes possible to use statistics to test claims. Rather than relying on a few striking examples, random simulations can tell us how often apparent month-like sequences would show up in arbitrary scratch patterns. Cross-cultural comparisons can ask whether similar-looking tally systems appear in later societies that we actually understand and what they were used for. And negative results would be just as informative as positive ones. If the marks don't align with lunar or seasonal expectations better than chance, we'd know to look harder at other interpretations. Open data also makes it easier to be honest about uncertainty. Instead of one persuasive diagram in a book, you have raw measurements that anyone can explore. Interpretations become proposals that can be checked, modified, or rejected, rather than definitive revelations about what must have been intended. In a way, that mirrors what the people who made these marks were probably doing themselves. Proposing patterns, trying them out against the world, seeing whether the sky and the animals and the weather cooperated. Before we move on, a brief pause for something related. If you'd like to drift off to sleep with more stories like this, slow journeys through deep time, human ingenuity, and the night sky, I've put together a book of episodes over at sleepytimehistory.com. It's written in the same calm, exploratory style you're hearing now, and for this week there's a discount for listeners of this channel. If that sounds appealing, you can take a look whenever you're awake enough to remember. Back with our Ice Age marks, there's a simple, steady takeaway we can hold without overreaching. Even if we never prove, to everyone's satisfaction, that a particular bone is a true calendar, the existence of these organised markings tells us something important about how people were thinking. They were paying attention to things that come back. They noticed that some changes in their world were one-off. An accident, a storm, a rockfall. Others followed rhythms. The waxing and waning of light in the sky, the passing of herds, the freeze and thaw. They cared enough about those rhythms to mark them, to make them countable, to make them countable, to tie them to stories and decisions. That is already a big step. Means time was not just a blur of days and nights. It had structure in their minds. Before and after, again and not again, soon and not yet and now. The bones and antlers we find are tiny outward traces of that inner scaffolding. Whether we label the result a calendar is, again, partly our problem of vocabulary. From their side, it may have been something simpler and more profound. A felt sense that the world moved in loops as well as lines, and that humans could participate in those loops, anticipate them, prepare for them, honour them, using the combined tools of watching, remembering, counting, and carving. What we might discover next, with better dating, sharper microscopes, more careful residue studies, and much larger shared datasets, is how far that structuring went. Were they just keeping track of a few days, a handful of moons, a short season? Or were some groups beginning to weave those shorter cycles into something larger? A whole round of the year, curving path through stars and stories. As our own tools improve, we may be able to say probably yes or probably no with more confidence. Until then, the most we can say, calmly and honestly, is that those marks on Ice Age bones are not random. They sit at the meeting point of memory and recurrence. They show us minds reaching out to meet a patterned world and trying, notch by notch, to make that pattern something you could lean on. In the next part, we'll stand beside those same people under an Ice Age night sky and ask what else they might have seen up there, and how the slow, steady motions of the stars could have joined the moon and the seasons in that early architecture of time. Picture the end of a long winter day 40,000 years ago. The hunt is over, the fire is burning low. Small group of people sit just outside the mouth of a shelter, wrapped in furs, breathing steam into the cold air. Above them, the sky is impossibly dark and clear, crowded with stars in numbers we rarely see now. Someone, maybe an older woman with a carved bone in her hand, tilts her head back and starts pointing. Not to name constellations the way we do, sharp-edged outlines and fixed diagrams, but to trace a remembered path, that bright cluster that comes when the deepest cold has passed, the red star that stands just above the ridge when the reindeer are heavy with fat, the place on the horizon where a certain star sets just before the rivers break and the birds return. Beside her, a child holds a small piece of antler. The surface is already lined with marks. Some were cut earlier in the season, when the moon first grew thin and then bright again. Tonight, under the clear sky, one more notch is added, matching a story, a direction, a point of light. To us, looking back across tens of thousands of years, that little scene is mostly guesswork. We can't read their language. We can't be sure which marks on which bones belonged to which stories, or how tightly they tied their counts to the moon, the animals, or the slow drift of the stars. What we have instead is a set of converging hints, regular groups of notches that look less like random scratches and more like deliberate sequences, objects worn from handling as if they were consulted and carried, not just made and forgotten. Sites, where bones with ordered marks turn up alongside evidence of repeated, seasonal visits. A sky that, then as now, offered reliable cycles to anyone patient enough to watch. At the edge of what we can know, there is a kind of quiet honesty we have to keep. We can say that Ice Age people paid attention to recurrence. We can say they had the manual skills, social networks, and the cognitive toolkit to track cycles and embed them in memory. We can say that some of their marks almost certainly organised time in ways that mattered for survival and meaning. Beyond that, we move into maybes. Pause. Maybe one particular sequence really did count lunations from one crucial season to the next. Maybe a cluster of rare symbols marked out the return of a certain star to a certain horizon. Host. Maybe some groups had gone further than we currently dare to claim, weaving moons and seasons and stars into an unwritten, portable year. That uncertainty isn't a failure. It's the shape of the mystery itself. Standing under an Ice Age night sky, our ancestors didn't have writing. They didn't have printed calendars, mechanical clocks or apps buzzing reminders. What they had was attention, story, shared memory, and the simple, powerful act of making a mark when something happened, and then looking back later to see how many marks remained between then and now. In a way, we're doing something similar when we study their bones and antlers. We count, we compare, we line up patterns with the motions of the moon and the stars, and we tell careful stories about what might have been, if you'd like to keep exploring those stories. Slow journeys through deep time, quiet puzzles, and the lives of people who watched the same sky you see now. I've put together a book about prehistoric secrets and other deep history mysteries. You can read more about it and pick up a copy if you'd like at sleepytimehistory.com. If this episode has helped you drift towards sleep or simply given you something calm to think about, it helps a lot if you tap like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment. I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from, and what the night sky looks like above you when you step outside. Somewhere, far behind us in time, a small group once looked up at their own sky and began to make sense of its cycles with nothing but their eyes, their stories, few soft pieces of bone. We can't hear their exact words, but the marks they left tell us enough to feel a quiet connection. That they too, counting the days between darkness and light,